Emily Wilson had everything: family, security, a quiet life in the village of Ashford. But behind closed doors she was hiding a secret that would destroy it all. James Collins, a quiet farmer on the outskirts of town, became the man who would unravel her world. When Emily's body was found under mysterious circumstances, the investigation would reveal a shocking truth that no one saw coming. Was her affair with James the cause of her brutal end, or was there something even darker at play? Secrets, lies, and betrayal had all led to one deadly conclusion. The village of Ashford had always been a place where time seemed to stand still. Tucked away in the rolling hills of Somerset, it was the kind of quiet community where everyone knew everyone else. Children played in the streets, neighbors chattered over fences, and the pace of life was unhurried, peaceful, almost idyllic. The Wilson family, living in a grand house at the edge of the village, were seen as pillars of the community. John Wilson, the head of the household, ran a successful local hardware store, while his wife, Emily, spent her days managing their home and attending social events. Together, they seemed to have it all: success, wealth, and a picture-perfect life. Emily, in her early 30s, was a beautiful woman with striking blonde hair and bright blue eyes. She had always been admired by those around her for her elegance and charm. Yet, despite the outward appearance of having everything, Emily felt suffocated by her life. She loved John, but over the years their relationship had become stale. John was a hard-working man who had grown more and more absorbed in his business, leaving Emily to feel more like an accessory than an equal partner. Their marriage, once full of hope and passion, had turned into a routine, with little communication beyond the bare necessities. As the months passed, Emily's loneliness deepened. She had everything materially, but something was missing. The vibrant woman who once had big dreams of adventure and excitement found herself spending long, solitary hours in their large home. She couldn't help but feel isolated in a marriage that seemed to lack the warmth and connection she craved. One morning, while out on one of her long walks to clear her mind, Emily found herself on the outskirts of the village, where the sprawling farmlands began. The scent of fresh earth filled the air as she strolled along a dirt path. She had always enjoyed the quiet beauty of the countryside, and it was here, among the towering trees and fields, that she first saw him, James Collins. James was a farmer in his mid-30s, rugged and lean, with hands that spoke of years of labor in the soil. His short dark hair and weathered face made him appear older than his years, yet there was a gentleness in his eyes that immediately intrigued Emily. She had seen him around before, but never really noticed him until that day. They exchanged a few polite words, and that was all it took to spark a connection. Over the next few weeks, their brief encounters became more frequent, as Emily found herself drawn to James's quiet nature and the peace he exuded. What started as a simple friendship soon evolved into something much deeper. James was different from John. He didn't demand anything of her. He was unpretentious, down to earth, and most of all, he listened. He didn't look at Emily like she was just a beautiful woman. He saw her as a person. It wasn't long before their friendship turned into something more, an affair that neither of them had anticipated. The secret meetings became their escape, hidden away from the prying eyes of the village. The chemistry between them was undeniable, and the illicit nature of their relationship only made it more intoxicating. For the first time in years, Emily felt alive. She felt seen, desired, and most importantly, free. But she knew what she was doing was wrong. Every moment she spent with James was stolen. Stolen from her husband, from her family, and from the life she had built. But it was too late. Emily had crossed a line. In the arms of James, she found the freedom she had been yearning for. She began to imagine a life with him, far away from Ashford, from the confines of her marriage, and from the expectations that had always weighed her down. What she didn't realize, however, was that this forbidden affair would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. As Emily's secret affair with James deepened, the village of Ashford continued its quiet existence, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. James, who had always kept to himself, found himself torn between the excitement of his forbidden relationship with Emily and the heavy burden of guilt that weighed on his conscience. His life, centered around the farm, had been simple and predictable, but Emily's presence brought an intensity and complexity he wasn't sure he was ready for. Still, he couldn't deny the magnetic pull between them. In Emily, he saw not only beauty, but a woman who, like him, was yearning for something more, something different from the life they had known. For Emily, the affair became a way to break free from the monotony that had engulfed her. James didn't judge her for her past or her marriage. He accepted her as she was. His quiet strength gave her the confidence to shed the layers of pretense she had built over the years. In his presence, she could be her true self, unburdened by the role she had been expected to play. With each passing week, she found herself increasingly drawn to him, not just physically, but emotionally. She had begun to dream of a life with James, far away from the constraints of Ashford, where no one knew her name, where she could start fresh. It was a dangerous fantasy, one that she wasn't sure she could ever make a reality, but it was a fantasy that felt tantalizingly possible every time she saw James. Their secret rendezvous were well hidden, taking place in secluded barns or the quiet corners of the countryside, far from prying eyes. The thrill of their stolen moments added to the intensity of their connection. Emily's love for James, though it started as an escape, soon became something deeper, something more meaningful. She began to see herself in a new light, filled with desires and dreams she hadn't dared to acknowledge before. But the affair came at a cost. The distance between Emily and John became more apparent as time went on. John, so absorbed in his work, failed to notice the subtle changes in his wife. He could sense that something was off, but couldn't quite put his finger on it. Emily's late nights, her sudden need for solitary walks, and her increasingly distant demeanor all pointed to the fact that something had shifted. Yet John was reluctant to confront his wife directly. He couldn't believe that Emily, the woman he had married and built a life with, would betray him. Instead, he buried his suspicions in work, convinced that whatever was going on would eventually pass. Meanwhile, Emily's internal conflict grew. She loved James, but she couldn't ignore the life she had with John. They had built a family, a home, and a future together. The guilt of her affair gnawed at her, especially as she began to see John's increasing loneliness. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine. She had begun to entertain the idea of leaving him, of leaving Ashford behind, but the thought of breaking up her family was one that caused her immense pain. The affair, though thrilling, had placed Emily in an impossible situation. She was torn between the life she had known and the life she could never have. James, for his part, felt a sense of growing unease as well. He had never intended for things to go this far. What had started as a brief distraction had now become a complicated emotional entanglement. He knew the risks involved. The idea of leaving Ashford behind for Emily seemed far more complicated than he had originally envisioned. But the more time they spent together, the harder it became to imagine a future without her. Meanwhile, word began to spread. Ashford was a small village, and secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. A few of James's closest friends had begun to whisper about his relationship with Emily, and though no one dared speak openly, the rumors started to leak out into the community. It wasn't long before Greg, John's longtime business associate, heard the whispers. He had known John for years and considered him a close friend, but even he couldn't ignore the suspicious behavior surrounding Emily. Something was off. The late-night walks, the unusual absences, the strained atmosphere at the Wilson household. Greg began to put two and two together. He wasn't sure what he had uncovered, but he knew enough to know that there was trouble brewing in the Wilson marriage. He wasn't the type of person to meddle in other people's lives, but his concern for John pushed him to take action. He couldn't bear to see his old friend in the dark about what was happening right under his nose. The secrets of the affair were unraveling, and soon they would no longer be hidden. As the weeks passed, the weight of the affair began to take a toll on Emily. The guilt, which had initially been manageable, became a constant presence in her thoughts. Every stolen moment with James was both a relief and a reminder of the betrayal she was committing. She felt as though she were living two separate lives, one in the comfort of her home with John, and the other in the quiet, intimate moments with James. The internal conflict was beginning to overwhelm her. Each time she looked at John, she saw the man she had once loved, the man who had given her everything material she could ever want, but now there was a distance between them that she couldn't ignore. John, for his part, was starting to pick up on the signs. His suspicions had been growing ever since he noticed Emily's late nights and the coldness between them. He had always trusted her, but now every glance she gave him seemed empty, every touch felt distant. He tried to push his doubts aside, burying himself deeper in his work, but the cracks in their marriage were becoming more impossible to ignore. John wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but something was wrong. He could feel it in the air between them. One evening, John received a phone call from Greg, his business associate. They had worked together for years, and though their relationship was mostly professional, John had always trusted Greg's judgment. The conversation was brief, but enough to stir up the unease that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Greg casually mentioned rumors he had heard about Emily and a farmer from the outskirts of the village. The name James Collins was dropped like a bombshell, and suddenly everything clicked into place for John. The late-night walks, the odd behavior, it all made sense now. His mind raced as he struggled to comprehend the reality of what Greg was suggesting. For the first time in a long time, John's anger surged. He had always prided himself on being calm and collected, but now he found himself consumed by a storm of emotions. Betrayal, confusion, rage, each feeling mixed together in a volatile concoction. The thought of Emily with another man, the thought of James touching her, made his blood run cold. But even more unsettling was the fact that John had no idea how deep the affair had gone. He needed answers. With a heavy heart, John decided to confront Emily. That evening, as he sat in the quiet of their living room, he steeled himself for the conversation he had been avoiding. Emily returned home later than usual, her face pale, her movements almost robotic. John watched her for a moment, searching for any sign of guilt, but she remained calm, too calm. He asked her directly if there was any truth to the rumors Greg had mentioned. Her response was immediate, but her eyes flickered, betraying her. She denied everything, insisted that she had been nothing but faithful, but John could sense the lie in her words, the hesitancy in her voice. The confrontation spiraled into an argument, each word cutting deeper than the last. Emily tried to explain herself, but the more she spoke, the more she realized how trapped she felt. She loved James, but she had never wanted to hurt John. She had hoped the affair would remain a fleeting escape, a brief moment of excitement, but it had become something she could no longer deny. John, on the other hand, was consumed by the pain of her betrayal. He couldn't fathom how things had come to this. He had always provided for her, always been there for her. How could she do this to him? But Emily's confession was not the only blow. The realization that their marriage, the life they had built together, had crumbled under the weight of her actions shattered John. He was no longer the man who ran his hardware store with pride. The sense of self-assurance he once carried was now replaced by an overwhelming sense of failure. He could no longer look at Emily without seeing the woman who had betrayed him. As the conversation ended, neither of them knew how to move forward. Emily, though relieved to have come clean, felt the crushing weight of her decisions. She knew her affair with James had become too entangled to simply walk away from. The emotional cost was too great. John, on the other hand, was left with a sense of numbness. His mind was a blur of confusion and anger. He knew this wouldn't be the end of it. The revelations would only deepen, and the destruction would be greater than either of them could have imagined. What started as a simple betrayal would soon escalate into something far more dangerous. The days following Emily's confession were filled with an eerie silence. The air in the Wilson household had thickened, as if even the walls had absorbed the tension between the couple. John was no longer the man who had once run his business with confidence and pride. The truth of Emily's betrayal had shattered him, leaving him broken and uncertain. He moved through their home like a ghost, his mind replaying every moment with her, every subtle sign that now seemed so obvious in hindsight. The love they had once shared felt like a distant memory, clouded by the weight of the affair. Emily, on the other hand, found herself in a twisted limbo. She had confessed, yes, but the relief she had expected didn't come. Instead, there was a gnawing emptiness that settled in her chest. She had known deep down that telling John the truth would end their marriage, but the reality of it hit harder than she had imagined. The guilt weighed on her like an anchor. She had hoped in the back of her mind that her confession might somehow restore their relationship, but it had only driven a deeper wedge between them. She had lost John, and now she feared she was losing herself. James, too, was wrestling with the consequences of their affair. When he had first met Emily, it had seemed like a harmless flirtation, a brief escape from the daily grind of farm life. But now, the weight of his involvement in the affair had spiraled out of control. He had never intended for things to get this serious. He was just a farmer, a man of few words, who had found comfort in Emily's company. But now he was deeply entangled in a situation that threatened to destroy everything. He had promised Emily they would run away together, to a quiet life in the hills where they could start over. But as the affair grew more intense, he found himself second-guessing the reality of such a life. He had always been content with his solitude. The idea of uprooting his entire existence for a life with Emily seemed more complicated by the day. James's feelings were mixed. He loved Emily, but the promise of a new life with her began to feel like a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. He had his farm, his routine, his peace. Was he willing to risk it all for something so uncertain? And more importantly, what if the truth of the affair was exposed? What if John found out? The events of that fateful evening were now a constant replay in James's mind. He had witnessed the final confrontation between Emily and John. The raw, volatile emotions had sent a shiver down his spine, and he knew, as soon as he saw the way John's face twisted in anger, that something terrible was about to happen. He hadn't expected it to escalate the way it did. As John stormed off in a fit of rage, leaving Emily standing in the rain, James had instinctively followed her. When he arrived, Emily was collapsed on the side of the road, her body limp and lifeless. The sight of her, pale and unmoving, sent a shock through his entire being. The reality of the moment hit him with full force. Emily was dead. James's heart raced as he knelt beside her, checking for any sign of life. But it was clear she was gone. The sharp, jagged fear coursed through him as his mind raced. How had this happened? What had gone so wrong? The primal instinct to protect himself kicked in. He knew without a doubt that he couldn't let the truth come to light. The community of Ashford wouldn't just condemn John for his actions, they would turn their suspicion toward him. He couldn't risk it. He couldn't lose everything. So, in a panic, James did the unthinkable. He staged the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. He moved Emily's body and left clues that pointed toward a stranger, someone outside the village. He wanted to protect John from the full weight of the crime, but he also wanted to buy himself time to figure out what to do next. His plan was desperate, but in his mind, it was the only way to avoid ruin. The next morning, the village awoke to the shocking news of Emily's death. The investigation began immediately, but the evidence was scarce. The scene didn't add up to a typical robbery, but the idea of an outsider committing the crime was too tempting to ignore. The local authorities, though puzzled, didn't suspect foul play from anyone within the village. James breathed a sigh of relief, though it was short-lived. His conscience would not allow him to escape the truth for long. The weight of his lie began to gnaw at him, and with each passing day, James grew more paranoid. The guilt over Emily's death, combined with his role in covering it up, consumed him. He found himself unable to sleep, haunted by the thought of being found out. He couldn't escape the feeling that the walls were closing in around him. What started as an affair filled with passion and excitement had spiraled into a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up.
But the truth had a way of revealing itself, and the longer James tried to cover up the crime, the more tangled his web became. The villagers may have believed his lies, but time was running out. The investigation into Emily's death began to gain momentum, though the village of Ashford remained shrouded in a heavy cloud of confusion. Local authorities were initially perplexed. On the surface, the circumstances surrounding her death seemed like the result of a violent robbery gone wrong, but there were inconsistencies in the scene that made it difficult to accept that explanation. The absence of any stolen valuables, the lack of struggle, and the strange way Emily had been positioned left the police with more questions than answers. Still, the initial focus was on an unknown outsider, a drifter, perhaps, who had passed through the village. The theory seemed plausible to the untrained eye, and the authorities were content to follow that lead for the time being. James, who had initially managed to maintain his composure, was beginning to crack under the weight of his actions. Though the police didn't suspect him directly, the guilt gnawed at him constantly. Every time he walked through the village, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be watching him, that someone might sense something was off. His days on the farm were no longer filled with the peaceful routine they once had. Every moment felt heavy, and every step he took seemed to echo louder in his ears. The weight of Emily's death hung over him like a dark cloud, suffocating him. As the investigation dragged on, one person became more curious than most: Greg. He had been close to John for years, and when the news of Emily's death spread, he couldn't help but feel that something was amiss. His suspicions had first been piqued when John had become distant and withdrawn after the confrontation with Emily. He had seen the way John reacted, how broken he was, and it didn't sit right with him. Greg knew John too well. John had always been a man of integrity, and he didn't believe that his friend could have been capable of something as violent as what had occurred. Greg had been hesitant to get involved, unsure of how to approach the situation, but the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that something wasn't right. He decided to pay a visit to the farm, hoping to talk to James and get a better sense of his role in the events leading up to Emily's death. It was there, amidst the familiar sounds of the animals and the quiet rhythm of farm life, that Greg found James acting strangely. Nervous, on edge. James's demeanor immediately raised red flags. His responses to Greg's questions were curt, and his usual calm composure had been replaced with anxiety. But it was the way James avoided eye contact that truly unsettled Greg. He knew that look. It was the same look of a man who was hiding something. Greg's instincts told him that James knew more than he was letting on. At that moment, Greg decided that he couldn't let things go. He had to confront the truth, for John's sake, and for the sake of the truth itself.